Rain had been falling on Ashfall Gorge for 4 days before it took him, and I had stopped noticing the sound of it the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. Until the morning it changed pitch, and I understood, half a breath before anyone shouted, that the terraces were about to flood. I was already awake. I am always already awake before the hold needs me to be. 19 years of that habit had worn itself into my bones the way water wears a channel into stone, until there was no longer a difference between Wren who chooses to rise early and Wren who cannot help it. I was checking the drainage cuts above the third terrace when the Gorge's voice changed, a low roar climbing into something with teeth in it, and I looked up in time to see the wall of brown water come around the bend, where the old rope bridge used to stand, before last spring took the bridge too. There was a man on it. Not on the bridge, there was no bridge, on a raft of broken planking that must once have been part of a border post, spinning, going under, coming up, one arm hanging wrong even from that distance. Wren, get back from the ledge. That was Corwin, Old Turnip, the whole hold called him, on account of a face like one, already backing away from the water himself, lantern still lit and useless in the gray morning, waving it like it might do something against a flood. That's not our business, girl, that's keep business, wait for the riders. There were no riders. There was a man about to drown 30 yards below me, and there was me, and the gap between those two facts had never once in my life felt like something I was permitted to leave open. I went in above the second terrace wall, where the current still had some shape to it before it broke apart entirely on the rocks below. I have pulled sheep out of spring flood since I was 11 years old. I know the trick of it. You do not fight water. You let it carry you sideways until you're beside the thing you want instead of in front of it, fighting a current with more strength in one surge than your whole body has in a lifetime. I knew the trick, and the cold still took my breath on the first stroke and half my sense on the second, and by the third stroke I no longer knew the trick at all, only that my hand had found a fistful of soaked wool that turned out to be his coat sleeve, and that letting go was no longer a thing my hand understood how to do. We went under together at the rope bridge bend, came up separately, went under again. I felt rocks scrape the length of my shin and did not feel it, not truly, not until much later when the wound had to be dressed alongside his. The current wanted to take us both past the third terrace wall entirely, down toward the falls where the gorge narrows and drops 40 feet into white water that has never once given back what it takes. I knew that, the whole hold knows that, it is the first thing children are taught about Ashfall Gorge, and I remember thinking, with a strange, distant calm that I have never fully understood since, that if the water took us both over the falls together, it would at least mean neither of us went alone. It did not take us over. My knee found the low wall at the third terrace first, by luck or by the water finally tiring of us, and I hooked my arm through a drainage gap in the stone and held, screaming his name, a name I did not yet have, so I believe I only screamed hold on, hold on, hold on, until Corwin's boy Danny and 2 of the terrace hands came scrambling down with a rope and hauled us both up onto the stone like fish. He was not breathing right. I put both hands flat on his chest, the way old Marin taught me before she died, and pressed until the water came up out of him in a rush, and he coughed himself half-conscious against my arm, gray eyes opening on a world that plainly startled him more than the flood had. There, I said to no one, because saying something out loud kept my own teeth from chattering too hard to think straight. There you are. Who? He started, and then his arm shifted wrong against the stone, and a sound came out of him low and involuntary, and his jaw locked against it. Don't talk, don't move that arm. I was already working my sodden shawl free to bind it against his side. You're at Ashfall Terraces below Greyhollow Keep. You went into the gorge, I don't know how, and right now I don't care. We need you off this wall before the water rises again. You went in after me. He said it almost as an accusation, as if I'd done something to him rather than for him. Somebody had to. Nobody had to. Then it's a good thing I don't listen when people tell me that, I said, and got my shoulder under his good arm, and between the two of us and Danny's rope, we made it the rest of the way up off the ledge, Corwin finding his courage again only once the worst of the danger had already passed. He was fevered by nightfall, which did not surprise me, cold water and a broken arm, and however long he'd been in the gorge, before I ever saw him will do that to even a strong man, and he was plainly a strong man, built like the terrace walls themselves, all long muscle under the borrowed shirt Corwin's wife had found for him. I sat up with him through the worst of it, the way I had sat up with half the hold at one time or another, changing the cloth on his forehead, listening to him mutter things in his sleep that made no sense to me then. "Hold the eastern line," he said once, sharp as a command, and another time quieter, almost broken. I only asked them to be honest with me. And twice he reached for something at his hip that wasn't there, a blade or a hilt his hand knew the shape of even fevered and half-drowned, before some deeper instinct told him it was gone, and let his hand fall open again. "Old habit," he told me the next morning, when he was lucid enough to notice me watching him do it a third time, and did not explain further. I set the arm properly at first light, the fever having broken enough overnight that he was steady for it. He let me do it without a sound past one sharp breath through his nose, watching my hands the whole while with an attention that unsettled me. Not the polite half-attention most people give a girl working, but the whole of himself turned toward what I was doing, as if the doing of it mattered to him as much as the outcome. "You do that in your sleep," I told him, once the splint was bound and I'd eased him back against the wall of pillows I'd made from every spare blanket in my hut. "Reach for a weapon." "Old habit," he said again, more carefully this time, the way a man says a true thing while holding back the whole of it. "Where did you learn to set a break like that?" "That's not terrace work. Marin's work." I busied myself banking the fire so I wouldn't have to watch him watch me answer. She raised me healer for the whole hold once before her hands got too shaky to trust with a blade or a needle. Taught me everything she could before she went, 3 winters back. I was 11 when she took me in. My own mother died birthing me and my father drowned in this same gorge 2 years later, so there wasn't anyone else to take me, and Marin never had children of her own, so I suppose we suited each other's gaps. "You work both trades, terrace and healing." "I work whatever needs working. That's not a complaint, it's just true." I glanced back at him. "You've asked me 4 questions and answered none of mine." "What's your name?" Something moved behind his eyes, not a lie forming, I would come to understand over the following days, but a decision being weighed, turned over, examined from every side the way I turn over a root before I decide whether it's safe to use. "Alaric," he said finally. "I was riding the border of the keep's lands alone when the gorge took the path out from under my horse. That part, at least, is entirely true." "At least," I echoed, and let it be. I had learned young that some wounds get tended before they're ready to be named, and pressing too early only makes a person flinch shut. Torin came by that same afternoon, ostensibly to bring me a basket of his mother's bread, which was a kindness he had performed perhaps 4 times in as many years and never once without some purpose attached to it. Torin farmed the 4th terrace, and had, since I turned 17, made it known around the hold in the particular sideways manner of a man too proud to simply ask, that he considered me a reasonable match once I'd finished playing at healing and settled to a proper wife's work. "Heard you pulled a stranger out of the flood," he said, standing in my doorway with the basket held like a shield, eyeing the bed where Alaric lay with his splinted arm and his 3 days' growth of beard, watching Torin back with an expression I could not read at the time and would understand very well by the 5th night. "Corwin says nobody knows a thing about him, says he could be anyone, a deserter, a thief running from something worse than the flood." "He could be," I agreed, taking the basket. "He could also be a man who nearly drowned and needs broth and quiet more than he needs the hold's suspicion. I find it's usually simpler to tend a wound first and ask its history after." You always did think you knew better than the rest of us." Torrin said it without real heat, more habit than conviction, and I saw Alaric's good hand go very still against the blanket, the way a man's hand goes still right before it decides whether a thing requires answering. "I think," I said before that stillness could become anything, "that you brought me bread, and I thank you for it, and that you have a terrace to see to before the rain starts again. Good day, Torrin." He went, eventually, with the particular offended shuffle of a man who has not gotten what he came for, and cannot quite say what that was. When the door shut behind him, Alaric's hand unclenched from the blanket by degrees, and he said mildly, "He wants you. He wants a wife who will keep his hearth and stop wasting good hours on other people's fevers. That's not the same as wanting me." I set the bread on the table harder than it required. I've told him as much, more than once. He doesn't hear things he'd rather not hear. Most people are like that, I find. Not all people. His gray eyes were steady on me in a way that made the coal in my chest. I had already, by then, started noticing there was a coal, though I did not yet have a name for what fed it, catch a little brighter. "I find I hear everything you say a good deal more clearly than I hear most things anyone has told me in years." I did not have an answer for that, so I went back to the fire, and did not look at him again until supper, though I was aware of him watching me the whole while, the way you're aware of warmth from a hearth even with your back turned to it. Little Tamsin's fever came on the second night, and it frightened me more than anything the flood had done, because a flood is a thing you can see coming, and a child's fever in the small hours is not. Her mother came pounding at my door past midnight, and I was up and dressed and gathering feverfew and willowbark before I was properly awake, and it did not occur to me until I was halfway out the door that I was leaving a half-drowned, fevered, one-armed stranger alone in my hut. "Go," Alaric said, before I could voice the thought, already levering himself upright against the pane in his splinted arm to make room for me to gather what I needed. "A sick child doesn't wait on my convenience. I'll manage the fire myself if it comes to that. I'm not so broken I can't feed a hearth one-handed." I was gone the better part of that night, and Tamsin's fever broke toward dawn, the way most childhood fevers do if you catch them early and don't panic and know which root does what. Marin's teaching, all of it, working through my hands the way it always did, the only inheritance I'd ever been given and the only one I needed. When I finally came back to my own hut, gray with exhaustion, I found the fire built up properly, and a bowl of broth I had not left made and waiting on the table, and Alaric asleep sitting upright against the wall with his good hand still curled loosely around the ladle, as though he'd meant to have it ready the moment I walked back through the door, and simply hadn't managed to stay awake long enough to hand it to me. I stood in my own doorway a long moment, looking at that, a king, though I did not know it yet, fevered and one-armed, having taught himself in a single night how to keep a poor healer's hearth fed so she wouldn't come home to cold ashes, and something in my chest that had been a coal became, without my permission, something considerably harder to put out. "You don't stop," he said the third evening, when he was steady enough on his feet to sit outside my door while I worked the terrace beds by the last of the light, his splinted arm held carefully against his ribs. "Can't afford to. Hold takes its share of the terrace yield whether I'm tired or not, and Tamsin's fever won't be the last one this winter." I straightened from the third row, pressing a hand into my aching back. "You keep looking at me like I've done something strange." "You have." He said it plainly, no flattery in it, which unsettled me more than flattery would have. Most people, seeing a stranger drowning, call for someone else to go in. You didn't call for anyone. You went yourself. Then a sick child needs you in the dead of night, and you go without a moment's hesitation, though you'd have every excuse to send someone else and tend your own exhaustion instead. I have watched you do the hard thing 3 times now in as many days, and each time you did it as though there had never been any other choice available to you at all. There wasn't anyone to call. There's rarely anyone to call out here. I wiped my hands on my apron, considering him. Most people haven't spent their whole life being the someone else that gets called for. You learn to be your own rescue, or you learn to drown waiting on someone else's. That sounds lonely. I hadn't let myself call it that until just now. It was true, and saying it aloud surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. "Where I come from," he said slowly, watching the last light go copper over the terraces, "people call for me. Whatever the trouble is, a border dispute, a bad harvest, a council quarrel that's gone past reason. And I have spent a great many years wondering whether any single one of them would go into the water themselves if I weren't there to be called to first. That sounds lonelier than mine." He laughed, a short, rough sound, like the first laugh after a long silence, startled out of him. I hadn't let myself call it that either until just now. You have a talent for saying the true thing plainly. I don't believe anyone has done that to me in a very long time. Something warmed low in my chest at that, quiet and stubborn as a coal that has decided it means to keep burning whether you feed it or not. And I told myself firmly, it was only the satisfaction of honest work well received, and went back to the terrace beds before he could see my face do something foolish about it. It was that same night that the scouts came. I woke to Alaric already on his feet, standing very still by the shuttered window, his splinted arm forgotten against his side, his whole body angled toward a sound I hadn't yet heard myself, horses, moving wrong, too quiet for honest riders, too many for a single traveler. "Get down," he said low, not a request, in a voice I had not heard from him before, the voice I would understand within the hour of a man who has commanded men in far worse dangers than this one. Behind the hearthstone. Now Wren. "What?" "Border raiders. Small bands test the terrace holds most winters when the passes are thin on food. I've had reports of it at council for 2 years and never once seen it with my own eyes. Down, please." I went down behind the hearthstone, more from the please than the command, and watched him, one arm splinted uselessly to his side, 3 days removed from nearly drowning, take up the fire iron in his good hand and stand between me and the door as though there had never been a question of doing anything else. They did not come to my door in the end. Corwin's dog set up such a racket at the 4th terrace that the raiders, 6 of them, we learned after, thin and desperate men from a hold 2 valleys over where the winter had gone worse than ours, took what chickens they could and fled rather than risk a hold fully roused. But I remember, with a clarity I have never lost, the particular stillness of Alaric standing in my doorway afterward, fire iron still in hand, watching the dark where the raiders had gone, and the low, grim certainty in his voice when he finally spoke. 2 years of reports, and no one thought to send riders to see for themselves whether the holds along this border were starving. He said it half to himself, half to me, some private reckoning being made that I did not fully understand until much later. That changes. Whatever else happens after this, that changes. I did not know then that I had just watched a king decide, standing one-armed in a healer's doorway with a fire iron in his fist, to reshape how his own kingdom fed its edges. I only knew that I had never in my life felt so certain that I was standing behind the right person. The riders came properly on the 5th morning, a dozen of them in keep colors, thundering down the terrace road with an urgency that brought half the hold out to their doors, Corwin's dog barking fit to wake the dead, Torrin standing pale and forgotten in his own doorway with a hoe still in hand. I was at the well when they reached my house, and I watched, with the sinking, sick understanding that comes right before a thing you already half know becomes a thing you can no longer pretend not to know. Every one of them swing down from their horses and drop to one knee in the mud outside my door. "Your Grace," the lead rider's voice cracked, plain relief breaking through keep formality. 5 days, Your Grace, and no word. We feared the Gorge had taken you entire. "The council has been." "The council can wait another hour to hear I'm alive," Alaric said, coming to my doorway behind them, his splint still bound, his hair still growing out ragged where I'd had to cut away a matted, blood-crusted section near his temple. He stood there in a borrowed shirt with mud on his boots, and even so, every line of him had changed the instant those riders knelt. Some easy, careless warmth I had only begun to know across 5 days replaced, in a breath, by something that had always, I understood now, been there underneath. Rise, and know this before anything else passes between us. I am alive because of the healer's apprentice at this hearth, and no other reason on this earth. See that it's understood, and see it's understood clearly, before a single word of counsel business reaches me. I stood at the well with the bucket forgotten in my hands, water running cold over my wrist, and understood in one long, dropping moment exactly who I had pulled out of the flood. You're the Alpha King. It was not a question. It came out of me flat, almost accusing, in the same tone his own voice had carried 5 nights before, asking you went in after me. I am. He said it without apology, watching my face for whatever I would do with it. Alaric Stonewake, though you've had the name 5 days and never once used it to ask for anything. I ride the border holds alone, without banners. When I can, it's the only way I ever learn what's true about my own lands instead of what stewards tell me is true from behind a council table, 3 days' ride from where the truth actually lives. I should have told you the first night. I told myself I would, once I was steady enough to say it properly, and then, a ghost of that rare, rough laugh. And then I found I liked, more than I have liked very much in a very long time, being only Alaric to you. A man you'd have hauled out of that water whoever he turned out to be. I wasn't in a hurry to lose that. Corwin had come to his own doorway by then, gone the color of old ash, plainly remembering, from the way his mouth worked without sound coming out, exactly how loudly he had shouted at me not to go in. Foreman! Alaric's voice found him without effort, without rising at all, and yet it carried the whole length of the muddy lane. You told her the flood wasn't her business. You'll remember, going forward, that everything in this hold is her business, if she chooses to make it so. Her hands are the reason your king still draws breath, and I'll thank you to see that no one in Ashfall Gorge forgets it. Corwin found, with sudden and total commitment, something urgent to attend to at the far end of his own yard. Alaric crossed the mud to where I still stood at the well, and up close, with the sling gone stiff at an angle and 5 days' beard roughening a jaw that riders knelt to. He looked less like the Alpha King the whole hold was suddenly bowing toward, and more like the man who'd reached for a blade in his sleep, and taught himself to feed a hearth one-handed, and stood in a doorway with a fire iron between me and the dark. I have a seal ring in my saddlebag that would have told you everything within the hour if I'd worn it into that water, he said, quietly, for me alone. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad you pulled a stranger out of a flood and tended him for 5 days and never once asked what it would earn you. I've had a great many people be careful with me because of what I could give them. I have not, in longer than I can properly remember, had anyone be kind to me for nothing at all. It wasn't for nothing. My voice came out rougher than I meant it. It was because you were drowning. That, he said, and something in his gray eyes had gone very steady, very warm, the way a hearth settles once the wood has properly caught, is exactly what I mean. He did not leave that day, though every rider at his back plainly expected him to, and the captain, a broad, gray-templed man named Beck who had, I would learn, served Alaric's father before him, took me aside within the hour with the particular careful courtesy of a man delivering news he does not think will be welcome. His Grace has responsibilities at the keep that will not wait forever, Beck said, not unkindly, watching me with an assessing look I did not yet know how to read. Council sits within the fortnight to settle the matter of Lady Isolde Vane's betrothal proposal. The whole of the Eastern holdings stand behind that match, and have for the better part of a year. I tell you this not to be cruel, healer, but because I think you strike me as a woman who prefers a plain truth to a comfortable one. I do, I said and meant it, though the plain truth sat cold in my stomach the rest of that day. He stayed anyway. A sixth night and a seventh, on some pretext of the arm not being fully mended that I could have argued against on Healer's own grounds and did not, because some quieter, truer part of me had already understood that I did not want him gone, and some frightened part of me had already understood that a king with a whole council pressing an Eastern betrothal on him had no honest business lingering in a terrace hold to hold a healer's hand. It was on the seventh night, with the fire down to coals and the sling finally off for good, that he took my hand, not the careful, patient way he'd let me hold his arm to set it, but deliberately, turning it palm up between both of his own, tracing the calluses the terrace hoe and the mortar and pestle had built there over 19 years of never once stopping. "I've been trying to name what happened in that water," he said. "Not the flood itself, the other thing. The moment your hands found my chest and I came back up out of the dark and saw you kneeling over me telling me there you are, as though I were something you'd been expecting all along." He pressed my palm gently to the place just under his collarbone. "There, something settled there and hasn't moved since. Not a wolf's instinct, I know that feeling well. I've had it all my life, sharp and restless and never satisfied. This was the opposite. Everything in me went quiet and certain at once, like a door I hadn't known was standing open finally closing on something safe. I thought of the coal that had caught low in my own chest that second evening, watching him teach himself to feed a fire he could barely tend one-handed, and did not have a healer's name for it either. "I don't know what to call that," I admitted. "Neither do I. I only know I have never felt it before, in a life that has given me a great many things to feel, and I have no wish to feel anything else in its place." He lifted my hand and pressed his mouth, once, gently, to the calluses at the base of my fingers, not to the soft inside of my wrist, not anywhere a man reaches for when he wants more than he's owed, but to the very part of me the hold had only ever valued for its labor. The hold called you the terrace girl. Beck's captains will tell you the council calls you nothing at all, because they don't yet know you exist. I intend, from this night forward, for both of them to call you nothing but what you are, the woman whose hands didn't hesitate when everyone around her did. If you'll have a king who very nearly drowned twice, once in the gorge, and once in his own loneliness, before he understood what either was worth. You already know I don't wait to be asked twice before doing a hard thing. My voice wasn't quite steady, but it didn't need to be. I'm not going to start waiting now. Council, Lady Isolde, the Eastern Holdings, whatever comes, I'd rather know the shape of the fight than pretend there isn't one. He laughed then, the full, unguarded version of that rare rough sound, and the coal in my chest caught properly at last, warm all the way through. Then you'll have the shape of it, all of it. I've spent my whole reign being careful with what I show people. I find with you, I have no talent left for being careful at all. Greyhillow Keep rose out of gray stone and gray mist exactly as its name promised, and I rode into it 3 days later at Alaric's side, in a borrowed traveling cloak that fooled no one, on a horse I'd never sat before that week, past a gatehouse of soldiers who did not know whether to stare or to kneel, and so did an uncertain, ragged mixture of both. The council hall was worse. I will not pretend otherwise, nor pretend it did not frighten me a good deal more than the flood had. The flood, at least, had only wanted to kill me, and had no opinion about whether I belonged there while it did it. Lady Isolde Vane's father stood at the head of a delegation of Eastern lords, with the particular still fury of a man watching a year's careful arrangement come apart in a single afternoon, and a dowager councillor named Lady Grenmore, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, looked me over from terrace boots to unbound hair with an expression that could have stripped bark from a tree. "A terrace girl," Lady Grenmore said, not to me, but to the room, in the particular carrying voice of a woman well practiced at being heard without appearing to raise it. "Your Grace nearly drowns, and returns to us not with a treaty secured but with a healer's apprentice on his arm and every Eastern lord in this hall insulted past bearing. Forgive me if I fail to see the statecraft in it." "There is no statecraft in it, Lady Grenmore," Alaric said, and I heard, under the king's flat calm, the same voice that had stood between me and raiders in the dark with nothing but a fire iron. "There is only the truth that a woman I had never met went into a flood that has killed border patrols twice her size and pulled me out of it, and tended me for 5 days without once asking my name, my title, or what it might earn her. I have spent a decade being courted for what I can grant, Lady Grenmore. I find I have finally understood the difference." Understanding is a fine thing for a man. Lady Grenmore's eyes had not left me. "It is a poor foundation for a kingdom's eastern border, which Lord Vane's daughter's marriage would have secured for a generation." It was Lord Vane himself, unexpectedly, who broke the silence that followed, a broad, weathered man who had been watching me with a different kind of assessment than his fellow lords, less offended pride, more plain curiosity. "You set his arm yourself," he said to me, not a question. "I did." "With what?" "Willow splints, bound in strips torn from his own shirt, because I hadn't cloth to spare and wasn't about to sacrifice good bandaging linen on a stranger who might have died of the fever anyway before it mattered. I hadn't meant to say it so plainly in a council hall full of silk and silver, but plain was the only voice I owned, and it was too late by then to borrow another. I've set worse breaks with less. My teacher taught me that a healer works with what's in front of her, not what she wishes were in front of her. I'd guess a kingdom runs on much the same principle, my lord, though I don't pretend to know it as well as you do." Something in Lord Vane's weathered face shifted, not agreement, not yet, but the first crack of a man reconsidering. "My daughter," he said slowly, "has never in her life said a bone, healer's apprentice or no. I proposed the match for the border, not for her hands. I find myself wondering, watching this, whether I proposed the wrong kind of match entirely." Lady Grenmore was not so easily moved, and the council did not settle that day, nor the next, but it was 3 weeks later, when a fever swept through the keep's own soldiers' quarters faster than the keep physician could contain it, and I worked 4 days without proper sleep alongside him, breaking it before it reached the kitchens and the nursery both, that Lady Grenmore herself came to find me, sleeves still stained with feverfew, and said, without preamble, the only thing that mattered. Lord Vane's daughter would not have done that. It was not an apology. It was, from Lady Grenmore, very nearly the same thing. "I withdraw my objection, your Grace's healer. See that the kingdom knows what it very nearly lost the chance to have." The hold folk came up from Ashfall Gorge for the claiming, nearly the whole of it, packed onto every cart and horse the terraces could spare, Corwin at the front looking as though he still could not quite believe the shape his own life had taken, Tamsin riding her mother's hip, still a little pale from her fever but grinning fit to split her face, and Torrin standing near the back with an expression I chose, generously, to read as something closer to acceptance than envy. I wore no silk. Alaric had offered it gently, and I had told him just as gently that I would be claimed in the same terrace boots I'd worn into the flood or not at all, and he had laughed that rare, rough, unguarded laugh, and told me it was exactly the answer he'd have been disappointed not to get. "The hold called you the terrace girl," he said, before the whole of the court and the whole of Ashfall Gorge both, taking my calloused hand in front of everyone the way he had taken it that 7th night by the coals, when there had been no one to see but the 2 of us and the fire. "I told you once that I intended to change what they called you. I find I've changed my mind about even that. Let them keep calling you the terrace girl if they like. Let it mean, from this day, the woman who went into the water when no one else would, and never once asked what it would earn her, and earned, by never once asking, the whole of a kingdom's gratitude and the whole of a king's heart besides." Corwin, somewhere behind me, made a sound suspiciously like a sob, and covered it badly with a cough. I did not look back to spare him the embarrassment of it, but I heard, later, that he had wept properly the moment the ceremony ended, and told anyone who would listen that he had once shouted at the future queen not to go into a flood, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making up for the shouting. There is a healer's house at the head of the Ashfall Lane now, timber and stone, built at my own asking rather than granted as some grand, unrequested gift. I would not have accepted it any other way, so that no apprentice after me ever has to choose between the terrace work that pays for herbs and the healing work that is who she actually is. Lord Vane's daughter, as it happens, married well within the year, to a border captain she chose herself, and sent me, unprompted, a letter wishing me joy that read as though she meant every word of it, which I have chosen to believe she did. And some evenings, when the keep's affairs are done and the fire has burned low, Alaric will still take my hand and turn it palm up, tracing calluses that never quite faded even after a crown had every cause to soften them, and say the same thing he said the very first time he understood what he was holding. That he had been called for all his life, by people who wanted something from a king, treaties, favors, a border secured, a match arranged, and only once by accident in cold water, by a woman who wanted nothing at all but to see him breathe again. "You went in after me," he says, sometimes still, half wonder and half old accusation, the way he said it that very first morning on the third terrace wall. "Somebody had to," I tell him, every time, and every time he laughs the same rough, unguarded laugh, and every time it still catches, warm, low in my chest, exactly the way it did the second I understood what I'd pulled out of that flood was going to be the whole of my life.